When you have mild cognitive impairment, you've already had, on average, 10 years of subjective cognitive impairment. That's been well documented.
Welcome to the Evolving Past Alzheimer's podcast, where we are focused on bringing you information to help prevent from developing and improve from suffering with brain diseases like Alzheimer's and other dementias. I'm Dr. Nate Bergman, a physician and Chief Scientific Wellness Officer at Kemper Cognitive Wellness, and I'll be your guide on these sound waves. So whether you're a baby boomer who's worried that your brain wiring just isn't working like it once was, or you have a loved one with the disease, or you yourself have already been diagnosed and are wondering, what do I do now? You'll want to listen to this podcast. Each episode, we introduce you to the top doers and thinkers that are revisioning Alzheimer's, dementia, and just generally things in life's second half. If you have questions or comments, check us out on social media. To support us, go to patreon.com/evolvingpast. And consider hitting the button and becoming a patron of this show if you find these episodes valuable. That's Patreon, Patreon, patreon.com/evolvingpast. So here we go. Let's get better. We have some pretty exciting stuff to talk to you about today. Our guests are Drs Kathleen Toups and Dale Bredesen. Dr. Bredesen was, of course, one of the inspirations for the show. He's a neurologist and researcher with an incredible academic pedigree, and over the last decade has been one of the leading voices, really, of hope in beginning to untangle and solve the problems we're facing with Alzheimer's and other similar neurodegenerative diseases. He is the author, as you probably know, of the New York Times bestseller, The End of Alzheimer's. Welcome to the show, Dale.
Thanks so much for having us, Nate.
Dr. Kathleen Toups is a functional medicine psychiatrist and a distinguished fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. Over the course of her career so far, she has run clinical trials, including 20 failed trials for Alzheimer's medications. She's an author of both peer-reviewed as well as popular literature on cognitive impairment, dementia, and other disorders. Her most recent upcoming book is entitled Dementia Demystified: The Definitive Guide to Resurrecting Your Brain, Reversing Cognitive Decline, and Regaining Your Memory. Welcome to the show, Kat.
Thanks so much, Nate. Glad to be here.
So all of that aside, all the popular stuff aside, really what I wanted to talk to you about today, and I'm really excited to talk about this because, you know, we've been talking about it together for probably at least collectively for 4 years, and some of us longer than that, is study results that were just released online on MedArchive. And I just want to, first of all, congratulate you for getting those results out there. It's a momentous step, and a step it is. And I think though, at least for the listeners of this show, we're all sort of sensitive to hype and maybe some mischaracterizations of some of the incredible stories we've heard about. This reversals of cognitive decline and dementia. So it's refreshing to have an organized trial on this. So again, congratulations. But I do want to clarify a couple of things, and maybe we could start with Dale on this. So can you just explain a little bit, although some people may be familiar with MedArchive because of COVID, and that was, sort of a big way of getting data out early on MedArchive. What is MedArchive, and then has this been peer-reviewed yet?
Yeah, that's a great point. And let me give just a little bit of background. We first proposed a trial when we first came to the idea that we needed to do several things to have an impact on functioning synapses and keeping synapses. This was 2011, and we were turned down for that trial. And then I'm really thankfully approached Kat later with the idea that to do this trial, because Kat has had a tremendous amount, not only of experience with trials, as you indicated, but also with functional medicine. So she's like the perfect person to be doing this. And we got turned down again in 2018 and finally approved in 2019. But as you indicated, when you put something on MedArchive, and this is what's been done with a lot of the COVID updates, it's the quickest way to get things out. MedArchive and bioRxiv, they're so-called preprint servers so that you can get information out very quickly. However, when you do that, it is not yet peer-reviewed. So that's the next step that we're all working on right now, which is to get this peer-reviewed and into a standard journal for publication. At the same time, as you know, there is a real revolution going on in medicine. So a lot of these standard reviewers are not going to want to see something that is not a drug, but is in fact a protocol.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. And Nate, I think the other thing to say about MedArchives is there are requirements to get your paper on MedArchive. So it did need to be posted on clinicaltrials.gov for the trial, and it did need to be an IRB approved trial. So the information that you do see on MedArchives is IRB approved clinical
Okay.
trial information.
For the casual listener, Kat, thank you for saying that. What is an IRB and why is that important in research?
Yeah, the IRB stands for Institutional Review Board, and that's a board of independent uh, people that oversee the safety of the human subjects in a trial.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So let's talk about the actual trial and what you can. Can one of you summarize, and we'll get into the details, but sort of in general, summarize what you saw in this trial? Maybe Kat, we can start with you.
Well, maybe we should say what we did before we say what we saw.
Well, we'll definitely back into what we did, but we want to give people sort of the big picture of what in general were we looking at? We were looking at people with cognitive impairment, and what do we see with them? Big picture.
Right. Well, we were looking at people with both mild cognitive impairment and mild dementia, so early in the process, but some of our patients actually were, definitely down there in the mild Alzheimer's dementia range. It was a 9-month study using a precision medicine or functional medicine approach that was individualized. And just to cut to the results, what we saw, and this is the super exciting thing, is that 84% of our patients improved. And when we compare that to any other trial that's been done with medications for Alzheimer's, the benchmark or the metric for success of a clinical trial is if the patients in the trial with the drug do not decline as fast as without the drug, that's considered success. So here in our trial, we have these beautiful results showing that actually a large majority of our patients improved. 84% improved, 12% stayed the same, and 4% declined.
And if I could just add one thing here, Nate, there are a couple of critical pieces, and you alluded to this with comparison with other things. First of all, the nomenclature, we need to change the way we think about cognitive decline because we call this mild cognitive impairment before dementia. And if you think, really that it should be called relatively late stage Alzheimer's disease. When you have mild cognitive impairment, you've already had, on average, 10 years of subjective cognitive impairment. That's been well documented. And before that, you've had some period where PET scans would be abnormal, spinal fluid would be abnormal, but you are still asymptomatic. So really, asymptomatic is essentially pre-Alzheimer's. SCI is really early Alzheimer's. MCI is relatively late stage Alzheimer's. And by the time you're actually called full-on Alzheimer's, where you're actually beginning to lose activities of daily living by definition, this is like saying someone has widely metastatic cancer. This is an end-stage condition. So as Kat indicated, the people that were in the trial either had MCI, so they'd had more than 10 years of pathophysiology, or they had, quote, early dementia, which is really very late-stage changes. And thankfully, these people, for the vast majority, as Kat indicated, actually showed improvements in their MoCA scores and improvements in their CNS vital signs neurocognitive index, which is an excellent online way. And even, interestingly, the MRIs even showed improvements. So very exciting results that Kat saw with her patients, and Anne Hathaway and Deborah Gordon all saw with their patients. One thing I was just going to mention is the semantics of success, as Kat indicated. When you give a drug, the big announcement recently was donanemab, which slowed decline. It didn't make people better. It didn't stabilize them, but it slowed the decline by 32%. Whereas Kat's patients actually improved, as well as Anne's, as well as Deborah's, actually improved, as opposed to simply decreasing decline. So this is a big difference in what we're calling success.
And I
Okay.
think we should take 1 second to acknowledge Anne Hathaway and Deborah Gordon. They were the other co-investigators on the trial with me. So this trial was done at 3 different sites. And so now we have, data that the methodology is not just from one person, right? This can be done across different locations with different physicians.
Okay. Yeah, I want to ask more about that in a few minutes. Thank you. So just to summarize, so between the 3 different treating doctors, Doctors Toup here and Hathaway and Deborah Gordon, who you mentioned, there were a total of 25 people and their care partners, which was, of course, a criteria to sort of be in the study. Was you had to have somebody who could help you execute all this stuff. We'll talk about in a little bit. And of those 25, 3 people got worse to some degree. 1 person noticed no real change, better or worse. And then 21 of the 25 noticed improvements. And I think in table 2 on the MedArchive paper, there's a shows that 14 of those 21 people that had improvements had marked or pretty impressive improvements. So that's like if I was just the regular neurologist that was sort of used to the humdrum of these trials, it would be like, well, that can't be right. Those people didn't have Alzheimer's, et cetera, all the usual things that we've all kind of heard. How, though, one question is, you mentioned kind of a cutoff. Dale had a very nice explanation of the pre-Alzheimer's subjective cognitive impairment, mild cognitive impairment, all the way through the end of the disease. How did you sort of determine the cutoff score? So you used a cutoff score of a MoCA, Montreal Cognitive Assessment, of about 19. Can you just explain what that MoCA of 19 generally means and kind of why you chose to include people that had a MoCA score of 19 or higher in this trial?
Yeah, in general, from 22 or 23 to about 27 or 28 is MCI. There are people who are at 28 with MCI, although it's often considered still within the normal range. The 19 to 22 is the overlap between MCI and Alzheimer's. So these are people who mostly have dementia. The other thing I should say is that people who had AQ21, so an AQ21 score is from the partners who say, how much problem does my partner have, or my spouse, or whoever that is, and typically, if they are having a score over 5, between 5 and 14, is considered MCI, and over 14 is considered dementia. And the people that Kat and Deborah and Anne saw, 3 of them had very high scores that were in the dementia range, and the others all had in the MCI range. They were all between 6 and 14. So they really fulfilled the criteria for MCI and early dementia. Now, the average for full-on Alzheimer's disease is 16.2. So we basically were focusing this, which many trials are focused on right now, for MCI and early dementia, early Alzheimer's, as Kat mentioned earlier.
And Nate, I think it should be said that these MoCA scores, when we try to think what boxes do they fit in for mild dementia, moderate dementia, they need to be stratified based on the education level of the patient. And so you can't just say the cutoff of 18 is mild dementia or 16, into moderate dementia. And it's very interesting that in our patient cohort, this was a highly educated bunch of patients. We had one patient with a high school degree, but all the rest of them had college degrees, and fully at least half of them had advanced degrees. So when we take a patient with a MoCA score of 20 for somebody with an advanced degree, that's going to be a lot more impairment than somebody with a high school education.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'd just say that people who have MoCA scores of 20, who have advanced degrees, really have significant dementia.
Right.
This is fairly far along in the process.
Right.
Yeah, and just again to push one more time on this, the 19 and up, is it mostly because what you've observed with people is that they respond more robustly the earlier you get people, especially to the kind of protocol that you used here?
Yeah, part of this, we had discussed this before we started this, and part of it was, what could be done. And yes, the anecdotes that we've all seen over the last several years, yes, we've seen some people with MoCA scores of 0 improve, but it's much harder. You have to work harder at it. There are more things you have to do, and it's less likely. So what we usually have seen anecdotally, everybody with SCI gets better. Most of the people with MCI get better, and some of the people with full-on Alzheimer's get better. The other thing is, this was comparable to other trials recently that have typically been in the same range. Aducanumab, donanemab, these are all kind of in that same range, MCI and early dementia.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Well, and
this seems.
Nate, I think it needs to be noted that this was a rigorous protocol, right? We asked our patients to do a lot of things and changes and lifestyle modifications, and so it does take a certain level of I mean, if the impairment is too great, the patients are going to have a harder time complying with all of the hoops that we ask them to jump through.
Yeah.
But that said, as Dale mentioned, we definitely have all of us working in this space have seen patients that are more impaired still get better. It's just that, it's harder. You're swimming upstream faster the farther along someone is.
It's totally a fight.
And let me add, I think that's a good point. But Nate, if I could add one other thing here, please remember, this is the first trial of its kind. So all we have to do is fail one time and it's over. Then we say, okay, we tried this approach. We've been claiming anecdotal success since 2014, and now we did it. But okay, and people will just look at us and say, yeah, see, we told you this was nothing, and now you've proven it. So we really wanted to make sure that we do as much as possible, get everything done, and let's give ourselves the best chance, because we all have seen anecdotally. I thought one of the things that was really intriguing to me as the scientist in this was talking to Anne and Kat and Deborah. They were saying, we don't feel comfortable about doing nothing and having a control group where we're doing just standard of care, because we feel that that's unethical, because we've already seen people get better with a functional medicine approach. So I think, there was a lot riding on this. And so that's one of the reasons I'm so incredibly impressed with what Anne and Kat and Deborah did, because they really showed that, yes, in a high percentage of these people, as Kat mentioned, 84%, you can actually see improvement.
Yeah, it is amazing. And I mean, I have a couple of other thoughts about that. I'll probably get to in a little bit, but I wanted to go back. You mentioned the 2014 paper, and I know that Dale, you had been speaking and writing about this even prior to that first reversal of cognitive decline paper in 2014, and during that period, you're really talking about this notion of metabolic subtyping, or segmenting Alzheimer's into different kinds of, call it a personality, or a label, or a set of conditions. How close do you think you were to correct based on the original hypothesis, and kind of what's changed over the last 7 years from what you're seeing, what you're now getting some data back, getting the trials are more organized, your numbers are bigger, you just have more look back and a lot more experience with working with these tools.
Yeah, we've all been talking about this, because planning the next trial, we're really seeing lots of things that can be done differently, things that can be added and things that can be changed. So we're all learning a tremendous amount with each person who comes through and with data from each one. So yeah, back then, the thing we started with was simply APP signaling, the amyloid precursor protein. This was straight out of a test tube. And so we could actually see the other molecules that interact with this. And we could see that, estradiol binds to its receptor, increases alpha secretase, and pushes your APP toward the type of signaling that makes and keeps synapses. We thought, wow, okay, great. We can trace the pathways. NF-kappa B, just the opposite. You can trace the pathway where it pushes the signaling toward synaptoclastic, toward pulling back on things. And so when we started looking at the very first people, the first person came in April of 2012 and was sent to me. I mean, I hadn't seen a patient in 20 years, and was sent to me coming out from the East Coast and said, can you help this person? And I was like, well, if it's a mouse, I can definitely help. But, that's about all I can really do. And so we talked for a couple of hours about all the possibilities. She was taking notes because she couldn't remember anything. And we were going through all these. Said, look, this is what we can do. And as we started then with these first people, we started seeing patterns. There were people who were more inflammatory. There were people who were more atrophic, and they actually started acting. They look different. They act as Kat well knows. They look different. They act different. And then we started seeing this group that was neither of those two. That was really much more ended up being the toxic group. And again, as Kat pointed out during the trial, they were seeing a lot of toxicity. I mean, I really think this is an underappreciated area in standard neurology practice, that these people do have a lot of toxicity in their Alzheimer's. We're seeing it now with this increase in Parkinson's that's being documented.
Yeah.
So I think that we're on the right track. Now, to be fair, most of these people have multiple, and what I've been writing about recently is it really is about an equation, and it's got 4 terms in it, and it's really inflammation, anything that triggers that, toxicity, anything that triggers that, and then in the denominator, anything that's low energy, anything that's low trophic activity. Now, there are dozens of things in each of those 4, but those are the things that were evaluated, and those are the things that seem to make a difference. And by the way, you mentioned the 3 who declined. To me, one of the most helpful things that came out of this trial is that the people who declined, you could see why they declined. They either wouldn't move out of they had one of them had a very heavily mycotoxin associated house, wouldn't move out, wouldn't remediate, and just sat in this horribly toxic environment, and no surprise, didn't get better. Other people, we could see people who actually had a little bit of a dip at the end because of the pandemic. So I think we're learning that a lot of what's causing and contributing to Alzheimer's can be ferreted out, and we can actually see when people aren't going to come around as well.
Interesting, Kat. I want to follow up with that point. So, did you see a number of people who kind of did some of the usual stuff and maybe got a little bit better, but then when you dug into toxins and/or infections and began to treat those, the needle was moving in a good direction in terms of cognition? Or do you agree? And I can ask the other 2 investigators, Deborah and Ann, at a different time. But do you agree in sort of what you're seeing, that when you look for and deal with toxins and infections, for that matter, although Bill mentioned inflammation and toxicity in specific, do you see the needle moving in a positive direction cognitively when you begin to treat those?
Well, definitely, we have the results to show that things moved in the positive direction. So, with regard to those subtypes, I think they're a useful construct for people to think about all the different factors that we're addressing. But in reality, did I have any patient that was a pure type 1 or a pure type 3? No, they all have features of all of these things, right? But it helps us from an academic perspective to teach people look for these various factors here. So everybody was a combination of things, though some of them might not have been very toxic, but perhaps they had a lot of infections, or they had a lot of inflammation or metabolic issues. That's the individualized part of this protocol, right? It's different for different people. But did they get better as we address these things? Absolutely. Now, did we see some decline because of the COVID lockdown? Absolutely, on that as well. I have 2 patients that that definitely had fairly significant mold in their homes, and they were improving at the 3-month marker. And then when they had to shelter in place, things went down. Now, one of them took the time of sheltering in place to aggressively clean and get rid of everything in the house, while she had, because they were unable to get remediators to come in early in COVID, right? They just wouldn't come to people's houses. Yeah. So that person used, the time to do her own remediation, and things popped back up. The other person who was pretty overwhelmed, he definitely declined from being, locked into the moldy home, for sure.
Yeah. So interesting, unfortunate, but interesting, because that points to a question that I think a lot of people around, and I mean, some serious people that Well, I'm not sure how they feel exactly about this kind of approach to medicine. I guess it's not important how they feel, but one question that I'm sure you guys have heard before, both of you. I'll ask Kat you this question first. So, diet, exercise, sleep, stress, getting the brain engaged. There's plenty of data that that's important, and
Right.
that at least from a prevention standpoint, and to some extent from a risk mitigation, and maybe in improves aspects of cognition. And when you put them all together, so there's a few trials going on now. When you put them all together, can we prevent? Can we improve? Um, how do you know? How do we know that the results of the trial that you guys just completed isn't just, hey, yeah, of course, if you clean up the diet and exercise and sleep, and you clean up those things, people will get better. How do we know it's also toxins, infection, and trophic activity and energy? How can we know that, or be
Well,
fairly certain of it
uh,
without, of course,
Gail could
certainty
probably
is
give you the
elusive.
details better than I of the recent study that Dr. Isaacson did, where he did the diet and lifestyle modifications, and there wasn't a substantive improvement, as I recall, in those patients. So I think, the issue of diet and lifestyle and sleep, that's where you start with general health with any chronic disease, right? That's where you have to start. But that, in my mind, is not sufficient to move the needle when people are having cognitive decline. And so, from our perspective, you really do have to address the toxins, the infections, and the lack of hormones. Those three things, I think, are the big things that have been missing from a lot of the trials and methods that people have been working with so far.
Yeah, and I would add, I think there is a misunderstanding here. People keep saying, well, obviously, lifestyle is going to help. Well, yes and no. This is not about just lifestyle. This is about this is about determining what is actually driving the neurodegenerative process. That's where I think the science and the clinical work match up so beautifully, because it shows what's driving the problem. And sure, if you tell everyone to eat better, you're going to get some people who get a little bit better. But as Kat mentioned, Richard Isaacson from Cornell just published a paper a few months ago, and in their study, they showed no improvement in people who had MCI. Now, they had, if a person didn't have MCI or dementia, they could get some improvement in cognition. But for the ones who had MCI or dementia, they showed no improvement. And in fact, then they actually tried to break them apart to say, well, let's see if we can at least find the ones who were the best compliers and maybe see a statistically significant difference. What they found was the ones who were poor compliers actually declined during the study, whereas the ones who were high compliers had an insignificant improvement, did not reach statistical significance. So even with that, they couldn't show improvement. Whereas with this one, we didn't even break them apart. This was the total group, and actually, thankfully, Kat, for example, did a fantastic job with bringing these people together and actually had meetings of all of them so that they could share information and really kind of help each other, which I think is another great part for the future, getting people together, social networking, things like that. And so there was a highly statistically significant, and I know that's not a term we're supposed to use, so let me say significant at the p less than 0.01 level.
Okay. For those that are in the know and care,
Yeah.
I guess that's important.
Well,
I agree. It's amazing when we get people together and get them organized around something with a purpose, and then you just get the groupthink and all of the woes and struggles and difficulties and costs, and I mean all those things start to come up, and it really is it's really sort of one of the magic ingredients, it seems.
Yeah.
The issue of stratifying based on compliance, we didn't look at that, but we did track our patients' compliance with all of the various aspects of the protocol that we asked them to do. So that was tracked and noted at every visit. Obviously, we needed them to be compliant, but some patients were more highly compliant. Some patients struggled with the compliance. Their brains and their spouses had trouble, and I do think that the amount of compliance was a determining factor as to how well people did in the protocol.
Yeah, and I think this brings up something that Kat brought up actually just as we finished the trial. we realized, okay, there is a possibility now. We can show for sure people can get better. But as she pointed out at the time, we did not show that it was practical. And I mentioned that in the paper. So that this is now the second piece, which is how do we now make this easier for people to do? Because it's clear that it can work, but it's not easy always for people to do this. And so that's a big part of this. Then the other piece of, the other issue is going to be, what about people who have lower MoCA scores? And then what about keeping people better? Now, one of the things we've seen anecdotally is that people who've been on this and stay on it stay better. So if people now who've been on this for over 9 years and are still doing very, very well and not having any decline whatsoever, so that's really exciting. And we want to see what's going to happen to the people who finished this trial, the ones who stayed on the protocol versus the ones who went off the protocol.
Yeah, because I definitely have mixed observations about that. Like one of my patients right now, living alone with dementia. Is in her early 70s. Amazing family. Just an amazing, not possible without this. The family that she has. I'm actually trying to get him on the podcast. The family's ready to go. My patient herself is not 100% sure she wants to put it out there, but she's responding. She started with for going by MoCA scores, lower, that she would not have been able to be included in your trial here because her MoCA was 15, and she had a really good diagnosis at the Cleveland Clinic and all that stuff, and but didn't, of course, there was really no answers for her, and they found out about this kind of work and sought us out, and one of the things that her daughters have talked about, and those are sort of her main people that help her, and they live out of town, is how much of a fight this is, right? Meaning doing all this stuff, and it really is a fight, and having to sort of remind each other and her herself, the person with Alzheimer's herself, that it's a daily fight. It's a daily fight. And Kat spoke to this to some degree just now, because we're asking people to do all these things, and you were asking people to do more and more stuff. Did you get sort of like a sense of what the key attributes, or some of the possible key attributes to people that seem to be succeeding were? And you mentioned higher education before, of course. If someone had higher education or low, it didn't, once somebody's 65, 70, to some degree, the ship has sailed. But key attributes to people that seem to be committed and improved over time.
I don't think you could put that in a box. I think that's a very personal decision. And it's also a factor of how the cognitive decline process is affecting their brain, what parts of their brain are there involved. So I think we've all seen patients that are brought in by a family member. The family wants to do the protocol, they're gung ho, but the person with the disease says, oh no, I'm not going to do that. I can't do that. I can't do the diet. And, it's sunk at that point, right? You have to have the buy-in and the commitment from the person with the disorder. And then you can work around with a team and figure out how to support them to do all of the factors. But I think it's such a painful thing when the patient themselves says, no, it's not worth it. I can't do this. It's painful, of course, for the family, right? But I think in that situation, it just brings, the issue of if you have to fight with the patient to do it, and I don't think it's going to be successful. And I think at some point you have to honor that patient's wishes and let them go with the process. That's the toughest thing to do for family members. But if patients are not committed, they're not going to get better. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah. And I do think this is the future, Nate, and you've brought up this same sort of thing before. Can we now take and say, look, yes, there are 50 things you could do, but our algorithm shows you that if you just do the top 5, you're getting 90+%. This goes back again to a balance. You've got to exceed a threshold that takes you from pulling back on synapses to laying down and keeping synapses. And for most people, that includes getting into insulin sensitivity, getting into metabolic flexibility. getting into some degree of ketosis. You've got to have the combustible substrates there. You've got to have some mitochondrial function. You've got to have some blood flow and some oxygenation. So there are some basic things that if you can get over that hump, and it's going to be different for each person. So there are some things that have come up again and again anecdotally. I always hear when someone says, "Oh, I started this and I lost 10 or 20 pounds." And I'm getting into ketosis. That's a good sign. They're on the right track. It's working for them. Whereas when they're saying I'm not budging at all and I'm not getting into much ketosis, so that's a big one. Compliance is a big one. Hypertoxicity is another big one. So people who just have massive amounts of toxicity, it takes a long time. You really have to push on them. And then people who, as we said earlier, people who are really far along, it's tougher. I'm always amazed when I get an email about someone who had a MoCA score of 0 who actually improved, which is really exciting to hear. And so those are kind of some of the typical things that come up again and again. But I look forward to the day when we can parse these out and we can actually pick up either with a computer-based algorithm or any way to say, okay, here are the top 5 things for each person, so that we can really pick up, what's going to make the biggest impact for most people.
Kat, can I volley something off of you that Dale just mentioned? He said for toxicity, some people that are like really have a lot of toxicity, we really have to push on them, I think was the words Dale used. What are the things that seem to move the needle in terms of toxicity, generally speaking or specifically speaking?
Yeah, well, obviously there's different types of toxicity. So a very common one in my patient cohort was high levels of mercury. And, we know on average, if one of our colleagues in our study group, Mirto Ash, presented a poster session at IFM a couple of years ago, and she looked at what her patients with cognitive decline presented with. And one of the things she found was on average, they had twice as high a mercury level as age-matched controls, right? And we know mercury is a neurotoxin. And the mercury was quite easy to get rid of for my patients. I had some of them with very high mercury levels. And, what we did was we immediately put them on a no seafood diet for about 6 months. And then with any kind of toxicity, we want to support the liver to help the detoxification. In some kinds of toxins, we add binders to bind up the toxins. And we love sweating, right? There's beautiful data showing that sweating we can excrete toxins, metals, and chemicals through our sweat. So we had a lot of people doing sauna protocols. And that was one of the pivots with COVID, because many of them were going to their gym to do the sauna. And then suddenly the gyms were closed and they could not go. And we were scrambling to find, low cost sauna options for people to have in their home. But sauna, I think, is a beautiful friend to help, for people with detoxification. There's so much data with the sweating. So it's kind of a combination of those things, but definitely pretty much every one of my patients that had elevated mercury came down to 0 in the study. And then I, told them, fine, you can go back to eating the smashed fish with the low mercury small fish in your diet again, because obviously there's some good nutrition there. But so the mercury is a one thing. Then, we had a lot of people that would have high levels of chemical toxins. And you can definitely see by doing a profile of the chemical toxins who is naturally a good detoxifier, and maybe they're 70 years old and they don't have a lot of toxins. And you can see who is a really poor detoxifier. I can test people in their 20s and they have high levels of all these chemicals. Well, what does that tell me? Their genetics are such that they do not detoxify well. So people do stratify. I feel like that just looking at the toxin test that we did is kind of a useful metric to say this person really is going to need more support for their detox systems, and there's, at my site, I used a broccoli extract protocol, a supplement called Avmacol, and they have beautiful research data with that. And so, we did that with some people. They were on, NAC and glutathione, and, depending on what turned up with labs and nutrient levels, that people needed. So pretty much it's, liver support and sweating, and then avoidance of exposure, if it's something like mercury.
So that's encouraging, because, I think some people, when they hear detoxification, first of all, some kind of detector goes up for, oh, well, this must be pseudoscience. And when you're talking about, certainly sauna's got evidence, certainly the sulforaphane, the Avmacol product has evidence, NAC has, I mean, it's been used in hospitals for years. I mean, all these things are
Right.
not like, they're not so far out. And what you're talking about isn't like some crazy take 1,000 things, do this, 9 hours a day as a part. I mean, it doesn't sound like an unreasonable ask of people. Do you know what I mean by that? Like, it's not.
Absolutely. I mean, everything that I do in, with my patients is evidence-based medicine. I mean, that's often the criticism. Oh, these are some quack doctors doing woo-woo stuff. And, and we did not use IV detoxification, right? Some people have, do protocols with IVs for detox. It really wasn't necessary. Get people moving, just moving their lymph around, right? That's a natural detoxifier. And of course, daily exercise was part of our protocol. So, there are definitely, rather simple evidence-based things that can be done for detoxification that aren't expensive, other than if you've got to invest in a sauna. But, there are some lower priced saunas that I've been able to find for people, and it doesn't have to be fancy. You just have to sweat, right?
Anyone that you like in particular? Any couple, two or three kinds that you like?
Well, we've dug into this with some of the higher end saunas, but there was one in particular. I'd have to find the link for you and give it to you. But there's some where you just sit in a cube of some silver space age looking material with an
Yeah.
infrared heat source on a, probably an uncomfortable chair that you can purchase for, in the $400 to $500 range. That'll do the job, right? So,
Yeah.
there's a range of things. The caveat with saunas is people say look for the ones that say low EMF. It's difficult. Anytime you're plugging something into a wall, it is going to generate EMFs, and some of them have ways of shielding for that. And of course, they put a higher price tag on the low EMF saunas.
Okay. I'm super interested by the toxicity piece because it's been so controversial. But like as you guys know, American Academy of Neurology added air pollution to one of the major risk factors for
Right,
Alzheimer's disease last year. Dale
right,
just mentioned some recent data on Parkinson's. And I do see, I just saw a guy who's in his early 60s, but he went and he worked in HR for a very large, prominent company here in Cleveland for a long time. And he was sort of a director. And a couple years before he had any signs of Parkinson's, he went to get life insurance, and he had a GGT, so blood test level that can sometimes indicate poor clearance of. Usually, people would think about alcoholics. Guys didn't drink at all, and it was like one of these blips on a screen, and it never went down. That was his only thing, and he had a little bit of issues with. He developed issues with constipation, and 3 or 4 years later, he was diagnosed with the early Parkinson's, and now it's like 7 or 8 years later now, and like it just it gets you thinking more and more and more about sort of the toxic soup and sort of a toxic world that we're creating. Not to go down that path, but like I think it's probably it's time to wake up and kind of smell the coffee and begin to do things that in other countries at least have been thinking about for a while.
Well,
Um,
I think the toxicity is the reason, one of the major reasons that we're starting to see people younger and younger and younger with cognitive decline. And Dale and I were just talking about this the other day. And, I mean, you mentioned I've done a lot of, long-term Alzheimer trials, and it was very rare for me to have someone in their 50s in my Alzheimer trials. I remember one quite clearly, and maybe that's all I had, and we're talking huge numbers of patients over the course of these trials. And now it's very common for us to see people in their 50s with cognitive decline. And so, we have to take note, like what is happening with that. And I do personally feel that the toxicity of the world and what's happening with that is a factor.
okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
And I would add
Um,
that, we all learned in medical school, especially way back when I was in medical school, essentially tip of the iceberg medicine. So we're seeing disease in its end stages. We're learning to pick up things like lymph nodes from metastatic cancer, and changes in in heart sounds due to severe congestive heart failure or severe valvular disease. And what's happening now is we're all now going below the surface and seeing all the huge icebergs of disease that are below the surface. And we're seeing, as Kat said, earlier cases of cognitive decline, more cases of Parkinson's. These things are all conspiring. Whereas, we were taught to use NAC, very specifically for a few types of toxicity. Well, the reality is there is a ton of accumulated toxicity, and we need to be looking much more carefully for these things. And that's where these complex chronic illnesses are coming at us from.
Yeah. I mean, maybe related to that, maybe not. I mean, one of the co-authors on your paper is another colleague of ours, Sharon Houseman-Cohen, who's down in Texas, in Austin. And of course, she has started a company called Intellex DNA, which, to kind of boil it down, does a deep dive genetic assessment. I think the publication said it sort of allows you to look at kind of a few hundred genes. And do you like? So I think the jury's split on the value of genetic testing, like by itself, kind of beyond the apolipoprotein E4 that most people are familiar with as far as, sort of raising a genetic risk for Alzheimer's. But how did you think that doing the sort of deep dive genetics was helpful in guiding treatment decisions or recommendations? Either one of you take that one.
I think there's levels to that and the utility. And of course, you have to balance the cost, right, with the utility, because it's not an inconsequential cost to do that testing. So there's a lot of genetic, when you look at genes, there are certain SNPs or mutations that have some clinical relevance, and there's others that, okay, you have these mutations, but there's a lot of redundancy in our genetic code, so you're going to have other mutations in the other direction, and it's going to even out. So a few things that I think are important that you can just get through regular lab testing on someone's insurance, right? You can check the ApoE, which gives you at least some predictive information about maybe how they might handle their lipids. You can check the MTHFR mutation, which I do think is consequential regarding detoxification and also making neurotransmitters for the brain. So both of that one is something that is, easy to help and support if somebody has that mutation, and you can check that from Quest. I also think the clotting factor genetics are huge for the brain. We need to know who tends to be hypercoagulable, because that's going to cause problems in the blood vessels of the brain and some of the vascular dementia issues. And so you can check a fibrinogen mutation, a factor V mutation. We can check fibrinogen levels, but you can check the prothrombin mutation and the factor V Leiden. So those are some easy things that, that I'll just check through regular labs. Now, what we got from the Intellex DNA were just some other levels of subtleties. Some people, the genetics would say, oh, they really are going to need more acetylcholine than other people. So many of the things that come on that, even we could have already, things I would have already figured out clinically by, say, looking at all their nutrient levels. We used the Genova NutriVal, which gave us a nice array of, many levels of nutrients and vitamins. And so many of the things were already being supported by the time we received those results. But sometimes there were some very interesting things that came up that would give us some clues of some things that we could support. So I felt like it was the icing on the cake, that it's, if cost is no issue, it's an interesting and very useful test, right? But when we try to drill things down to how can we make the protocol more accessible for more people, there are, other things with genetics you can just get from your regular insurance and ways to figure out some of the things.
And I do think as whole genomes come down to less than $500 and even down toward $100, everybody's going to have a whole genome. I do think that it's going to be helpful, especially in prevention. What you really want to know is when you're relatively young, what are the things that I need to do so that I never have to worry? The reality is Alzheimer's should be a rare disease, as we are all realizing. And if you know ahead of time, that's going to be helpful. And then, as Kat mentioned, things like clotting, really critical. And I, certainly there was a one patient that I remember well that was seen by Anne, who had some significant clotting, and actually it fit with his history quite well, and did well on the pycnogenol and nattokinase, as added to his overall protocol. So I do think that there are going to be some things, some of the glutathione nulls that can be involved with detox, I think can be helpful. So I do think it's very complementary to the biochemistry. One's kind of telling you what your risk is, the other one's kind of telling you where you stand.
Interesting.
And in knowing some of those things, because they, in those reports, even she, will provide evidence of, okay, they have this mutation, this particular supplement provides a workaround, so it helps to customize what supplements do you want to keep in, right? Because there's only so many supplements we can have people take, right?
Yeah.
And so, we have to figure out which ones are going to give the most bang for the buck and which ones do they really need. I want to follow up on Dale's point about, the more we can figure out these things ahead of time with our children. Like I remember years ago when I first learned about the MTHFR mutation, and I found out I was homozygous. I had 2 copies of that. I increased my methylfolate to 5 milligrams, and 10 days later my body and my brain woke up. It was just a huge change, and I thought, oh my God, what if I had known this all my life, right? What if what problems could I have headed off? And I immediately thought we should be testing all our children and supporting something like this when they're young. So yeah, I think that the genetics is an important component. It does add to what we do.
Wow. Kind of to round out some of the discussion here, I do want to see if we can figure out what will be the criticisms of this trial. Some of them have come up already. One of the criticisms would be that there were 3 different treating physicians, and Dr. Toups, you pointed, as one of the treating physicians, you pointed out, hey, that might be actually a good thing because there were 3 different treatment strategies. So not everybody did the same thing. Like a lot of places will require you to sort of predetermine what all of the possible treatments will be and agree to an algorithm of care. I'm curious if you could speak to that potential criticism if you haven't gotten it already. Hey, there are 3 different doctors doing 3 different things. So how do you make sense of that kind of idea?
Well, I mean, it's a whole cornerstone of our approach that this is individualized medicine, that there is no cookie cutter anything if we want to deal with human beings and help them to get well, right? We have to look at their individual factors and then we have to address those individually. The cookie cutter medicine has failed us greatly, with cognitive decline. So I see it as a strength, and I see it as a strength that we had multiple sites and that we had comparable outcomes among our sites, and that we were able to have success with 3 different people. Now we all followed the same initial protocol, so we determined what labs would we do and what would the workup be. We determined what diet we wanted people to work with, what type of exercise regimen, mindfulness regimen, the brain training, the various facets of our protocol. So everybody did that the same, but with regard to treating their toxins, their infections, their hormones, we individualize that based on the symptoms that we had. So I think it's a strength, and I would say that in a sense you could say what was replicated at 3 sites. We had pretty similar outcomes with our patients there.
Yeah, and I would add that the goal here, I think in so many ways, everything that we're now thinking about and doing with respect to cognitive decline is backward from what we've all been taught. We've all been taught there's nothing you can do about it, so don't bother. Don't find out your ApoE status. Don't bother. There's no treatment. All these sorts of things. Don't bother going in early. It's probably just normal aging. All these things which are completely backward. And part of this is let's use a Procrustean approach and just give everyone the same thing in a monophasic blind approach. And in this case, it was the opposite. It was let's see what's causing your decline. Now, I think one of the criticisms is going to be, why do you think that those things cause decline? Because there's not a lot written about mycotoxins in Alzheimer's disease. We don't believe that. So to me, one of the interesting outcomes was that this suggests that the things that we have been assuming the ones that are the risk factors that we've been assuming are causally related, are indeed playing some causal role, because when they were addressed, people got better. So that argues for a causal role of insulin resistance and of mycotoxicity and chemotoxicity and vascular disease and things like that. I am concerned that when you now try to ask 10,000 physicians all to do this, it's not going to be as easy, because I have to say, we were very fortunate. We have three really outstanding physicians. This has turned out to be much more like surgery than like standard prescriptive pad medicine, because you have to be good at it, you have to be experienced at it. And so there are doctors who are getting almost everybody to get better, like Kat and Deborah and Ann. And there are doctors who are getting almost nobody to get better because they're not doing the right thing. So I think that is one concern. And we tried to address in the paper, the various criticisms, like, is there a learning effect? Are you just seeing people who are practicing these tests and now they're getting better? And I listed a whole set of reasons that that's unlikely to be the case. And for example, CNS vital signs, they've actually published data showing that there is not a learning effect when you do it, especially with these sorts of 3-month intervals. And as Kat pointed out in the paper, the MoCA was it was 8.1, then 8.2, then 8.3. So there's not much of a learning effect for that. Also, you're going 3 months in between trials. If it had been done a week later, that might be different. And then we had external raters. These people were not involved, with the treatment of these patients. So I think there are a lot of reasons to believe that this was not simply a practice effect of these. But the other thing is going to be, we want an exact prescription. Give us the exact prescription. And it's not that simple.
But I think the more we can flesh out and define at least where do you start, right? What did we test? Right. What metrics do we think are important? And I do like to always, emphasize what I think, so many people are missing. I think that this, the testing and the treatment, we had a treatment team, we had, a nutrition people, we had health coach people, we had an exercise trainer. That exercise trainer was actually so valuable. I had patients that had never exercised, like ever. And by the end, they were really enjoying exercise, and it changed their life. But as we all know, exercise is one of the best validated ways to change your brain and increase your BDNF, right? So, so the team was so helpful. But I think that I like to emphasize that really you need to consult with an MD-DO physician because there's so many medical things that need to be addressed that are, that it can't be done just with your health coach or your nutrition coach, right? It really takes an approach to look at all of these factors. I think we had fantastic success reversing metabolic syndrome. I mean, looking at some of my patients, looking at their inflammation plummet down to normal, looking at their hemoglobin A1Cs. I never knew that I could move somebody's hemoglobin A1C down so fast when they really did a concerted effort with a very controlled diet and exercise and targeted nutrients and supplements. So I think that was a huge success with things. We haven't independently yet analyzed things like how many people lost how many inches off of their waist, and we know that the waist circumference and the implications for longevity are huge, right?
Yeah.
So there were many benefits that our patients had health wise, besides their brain, but. That's what I really wanted to say was, that I just don't want people to miss what I think are missed with too many things. You have to look at the infections, you have to look at the toxins, and you have to look at the hormonal status. I mean, of course, we've learned that, these hormones are so important to the brain that the brain is making its own hormones. The brain can make its own estrogen, its own progesterone, and its own pregnenolone. And so, these hormones are so important. And that was, I think, something in our protocol that was different from many people's protocols.
Definitely. Yeah, 100%.
And I would add cost and complexity are going to be two complaints. What's the cost and the complexity of this? And the cost, my response to that is always far, far less than a nursing home.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, people who don't go through this sort of thing are going to end up spending a massive amount. The average person with Alzheimer's spends $350,000
Yeah.
before they die. It's a huge cost. As you know, it's over $280 billion for the United States alone. And then, so I think it's certainly a good investment. And then on the complexity side, there's a tremendous amount you can do with some basic things, just as Kat has been talking about. So I think from both of those standpoints, although we may get complaints about them, ultimately it will turn out that this is the right way to go.
I agree. Hey, Dale, you mentioned right at the beginning the next trial, the future trial. What are the plans to flesh out and do a future trial?
So we're very fortunate that the foundation that supported this trial is enthusiastic about supporting the follow-up trial. And so the next trial, the idea would be that we're now taking that next step, which would be 100 patients, and this would be a randomized controlled trial. And there are other things we can look at, things like single blinding for some of the evaluations. And then so we're all going to sit down now and plan out this next trial, and we're hoping that it would be started. Of course, we have to get the IRBs to approve it, et cetera. But something like December, January. The good news is we've seen what it takes to move the needle in terms of time. One of the really interesting things was there was improvement at 3 months, there was more improvement at 6 months, and there was more improvement at 9 months, even though, as Kat said, a lot of the people fell off. The average for the whole group, though, was still more at 9 months. So the good news is we could do a trial that would be anywhere 6 to 9 months and really get a result. This doesn't have to be a 3-year trial. So many of these trials have had to be huge number of patients, multiple years, because you're looking at these minuscule differences. We're looking at much bigger differences, and therefore we could probably do 9 months. And I like the idea of having the control group go 6 months with nothing, and then maybe we started and show in the last 3 months that we can actually bring them back up again. So there's lots to discuss, but I think we've learned a lot from this trial and things that we can add. Should we be looking at plasmalogens? Should we be doing more with KATSU on the exercise side? Should we be looking more at EWAT? There's all sorts of things that we could consider.
Amazing.
And I want to just say a big, huge shout out to the Four Winds Foundation for funding our study and offering funding for the next study. And we are just so grateful to have the support of
Special organization, for sure. Yeah, we all thank them. Thank you.
Fantastic.
So again, guys, congratulations. Thank you so much for talking to us and the world about this. I'm sure you're going to go on a whole interview tour, probably in the middle. And it's exciting, and I wish you guys all the success in the world as you move forward.
Thanks so much for having us on, Nate. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for helping us get this message out. I think that's the most exciting thing, that it's going to bring more hope to more people.
Absolutely. All right. Bye. So that's our episode. I hope it was useful to you. Check out the show notes on iTunes or on our website where we've summarized the key points. If you find the information here valuable, please consider giving us a 5-star rating on iTunes and leaving comments in the comments section. It will really help us bring this message to as many people as we can. If you have questions or comments, connect with us on social media. Finally, to support us, go to patreon.com/evolvingpast and consider hitting the button and becoming a patron of this show. That's Patreon, Patreon, patreon.com/evolvingpast. Thanks. I'll talk to you next time.